My name is Jeannie Ludlow, and I'm also going to be talking a little bit about abortion and physical specimens, but in a set of different contexts, a contemporary context, and from the perspective more today of practitioner than academic, and from specifically a counseling approach, which is what I did at the clinic where I worked. In May of this year, at a reproductive justice workshop organized by Lisa Harris and her colleagues at the University of Michigan, an abortion provider spoke about the difficulties of working with patients who use anti-language to discuss their abortion decisions. And one example of this, she said, was patients who call it a baby. As she spoke, other people around the table were nodding. I still remember the first time this came up for me in the abortion clinic. I was in training as a patient advocate at the Center for Choice in Toledo, Ohio. It was an independent abortion clinic. It's recently been closed by Ohio's privileges law. I was screening a patient while the advocate trainer shadowed me. "I feel guilty because I'm killing my baby," the patient said. I didn't know what to say. I was an abortion rights activist. I had a PhD. I had studied feminist theory, and I was a former abortion patient myself. So I really thought that I was well situated to work as a patient advocate in an abortion clinic. And yet nothing really had ever prepared me to talk to a woman about killing babies. "Oh no," I said to her just as gently as I could. "It's not a baby. It's just tissue." The advocate trainer broke in, redirected the conversation, saved the day, and explained to me later why what I had said was really the wrong thing to say. Working in the clinic, I learned, mostly from the patients that I worked with, that the pro-choice arguments I have been using for many years in speeches and presentations and my teaching fell far short of addressing the ways that most people experience abortion. And that's true whether the people experiencing abortion were happy about their abortions or distressed about them, right? It's not just distress, but all of it. And one of the biggest gaps for me between my pro-choice discourse and my abortion care work centered around the fetal body and maternity. So I've been thinking for some time about our current political situation, which frankly ain't so great right now. And I've been thinking that it might be indirectly related to that gap between pro-choice discourse and abortion experience. And I think about how many women coming into clinics for abortions do not consider themselves pro-choice, much less feminist. I remember how many of the patients I talked with called it a baby, if they called it anything beyond it at all. And it occurs to me that perhaps attention to the gap between tissue and baby might provide some insight into the gap between pro-choice discourse and abortion experience, at least anecdotally, and I think maybe more substantially than that. And so perhaps I think we might begin to close that gap if we can speak out about some of the more uncomfortable aspects of abortion experience, like, for instance, the relationship between babies and abortion. In 2004, as I'm sure everyone in here knows, Frances Kissling famously called on the pro-choice movement to acknowledge the value of the fetus, the moral value of the fetus, and the potentially painful reality of its loss. And she wrote, "It has long been a truism of the abortion debate that those who support abortion rights concentrate on women, and those opposed focus on the fetus." And I agree, absolutely. Hidden in the gap of the U.S. abortion debate is the relationship between woman and fetus, a relationship that many of the women I talked to at the clinic took very seriously when they were making their decisions. But notice the language here, woman and fetus. Even as we critique the discourse, we reproduce it. She didn't say mother and child or mother and baby, right? She said woman and fetus. Mothers have abortions. We already know this. In the U.S., 61% of abortion patients have children. Everyone in this room knows that, I'm sure. And even those abortion patients who do not have children report that their ideas about motherhood influence their abortion decisions. And I'm sure also everyone's well aware of the Jones study, where they talked to women who were choosing abortion, and they found that women who had children not only talked about mothering and the materiality of mothering in their abortion decisions, but even the patients they talked to who were not already moms talked about motherhood as a reason they were having abortions, right? Their ideas about what the researchers call ideal motherhood. And the title of this study is, I Would Want to Give My Child Like Everything in the World, which gives us a glimpse into that relationship between motherhood and abortion for the patients interviewed. Many years ago, just as I was starting my work at the clinic, American poet and former Jane Judith Arcana wrote that abortion is a choice made by a woman or girl who is already a mother, no matter how ignorant, angry, sad, hopeful, or frightened she may be. Abortion is, she wrote, in the ordinary motherhood-type way, the concern of women who are taking responsibility for the lives of their children. Anti-abortion arguments and laws work to give us the impression that women who enter abortion clinics do not think that they are carrying babies. Many informed consent laws, particularly mandatory ultrasound laws and fetal development information, ostensibly are based on the idea that if we could just convince her that it was a baby, she wouldn't have an abortion. We know these laws don't work to change women's minds. This is because abortion is actually an act of motherhood. Women have abortions not to deny the existence of unborn babies, and not even in spite of the fact that we are pregnant with babies, but rather because we have babies. Not fetuses, embryos, blastocysts, or zygotes growing in our bodies. In Paula Kamen's play Jane, also about the Chicago Abortion Service, she quotes Heather Booth speaking about women's perceptions of pregnancy. And she has Booth saying, and the degree to which the play is fictionalized and not is, it depends on where you are, and I'm not going to draw that line. But she talks about how you see a pregnant woman walking down the street and you think baby. You don't think fetus. Several years ago, I quoted that line in an article about the fetus, and both peer reviewers recommended that I take it out. One peer reviewer suggested, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the line could provide fodder for the anti-abortion movement. Mm-hmm. The other reviewer said that the pregnancy we can see on a woman's body is not the pregnancy we abort most of the time, which actually is true most of the time. It is true, I get that. However, just about a year ago, my niece called me. I got a phone call from Cassie, and she said she was pregnant. As in, Aunt Jeannie, I just had a positive pregnancy test. And the first thing I thought, after 12 years of working at a clinic and 10 years of doing this kind of research, the first thing I thought was, oh my God, Cassie's going to have a baby. I didn't think Cassie's gestating, or she has a zygote, at that point, embryo, those words did not come into my mind. It's a baby. That's the way we think about it. A lot of the really important work being done on miscarriage by a lot of the people in this room, whose work I hope you are understanding, even though I'm not citing it, is undergirding everything I'm saying, teaches us that fetal age and stage of pregnancy do not determine a woman's emotional responses to her pregnancy or to that pregnancy's end. And this is just as true for women in the abortion clinic as it is for women whose pregnancies end in miscarriage or spontaneous abortion. Many abortion clinic policies reflect deliberate attention to the fetal body and consideration of women's relationships to their unborn babies. At the clinic where I worked, we developed a particularly effective system for talking with patients about the fetal body. And I want to make very, very clear that this was in place long before I started working there. I am not telling you something I dreamed up. Smarter people than I did this. I'm just reporting to you how I was trained. Our services included grief counseling for women who wanted it, and we strove to incorporate into the abortion experience each patient's own religious values and emotional needs on an individual basis. Our patient intake charts included questions about their emotional responses to their pregnancies and to abortion, about their religious beliefs regarding abortion, and about their support systems at home. We saw a range of needs and responses, from the woman who was happily relieved not to be pregnant anymore, to the woman who grieved deeply the child she could not birth. And fetal age seemed to have very little relevance to this, right? So I talked with women who grieved deeply their 8-week abortions. And I also talked to women who had 22 and 23-week abortions who were just glad to get that out of there and go home and go on, right? So these experiences, I think, speak to the complexity of abortion as it is lived by women. In many clinics, a lab technician or provider examines every patient's post-procedure tissue and supporting tissue, fetus and supporting tissue, in order to age it by size and to verify that the procedure is complete. In our clinic, the technician arranged the products of conception, is the sort of technical term, arranged the elements of the fetus and tissue so that we could provide each patient the option to see her fetus and tissue if she chose. About 5% of the women in the clinic chose to do that at any given time. We were, of course, very careful to prepare people before they saw their tissue. We used a fetal development guidebook, which I brought with me if anyone wants to see it, put together by 2 nurses who worked in our clinic in the 1990s. And with the patient who wished to see her fetus and tissue, we looked first at a line drawing. Now I'm going to show you a page from it. I'm going to skip through some. I just have my sources up here. Okay, I don't know how well you can see that. So this is a page from the Fetal Development Handbook, developed by these nurses who worked at the clinic. So we would show the woman a line drawing of the fetus of the same fetal age as the fetus she was carrying. And the line drawing is accompanied by descriptive text. So this is for 9 weeks LMP, and it says the embryo is approximately 0.84 to 1.2 inches long. The skeleton is starting to form, beginning with the skull. The brain is taking shape. Nerve fibers are starting to develop. So it's not in scientific language. It's trying to make it just as easy for a broad range of women to understand as possible. In addition to the description, there's a sort of general description of first trimester up above that sort of just describes how first trimester development happens over time. When screening a patient who expressed interest in viewing her tissue, I would go over this page with her, explaining that a fetus or a baby, usually baby because I said whatever she said, develops the way a house is built. The outside develops first, and then the organs can develop within the completed shell. This is why, for example, I would say at 10 weeks, the baby has toes, but even at 20 weeks, it doesn't yet have working lungs or nervous system, because it's kind of counterintuitive when you think about it. I would think we'd need our nervous system before our toes, but maybe I'm just a little weird that way. And I would answer the patient's questions, talking to the doctor if I need to, and checking in with the nurse if necessary. And then I would ask her if she thought she was still interested in seeing her tissue. And if she said she was, then I would explain to her that the next picture I was going to show her was a photograph of tissue at her gestational stage taken in our clinic. So the picture is a color photograph taken by a nurse at our clinic with permission, of course, of the patient, post-abortion. And this is what I would show her. The fetus and tissue are arranged in a backlit glass dish on a light box so that the endometrial tissue, the sac tissue, and these are all very general, non-scientific terms for non-scientific people, and the fetal body are distinctly recognizable. And depending on the age of the fetus, she might see tiny little dark spots. You can see them down here by the 6, which are eye buds, flipper-like limbs, perhaps a small rib cage, fully formed legs or arms. And when second trimester intact abortions were still legal, a small intact, fully formed body. I also have the page for, this is 14 weeks fetal age and 16 weeks LMP. So we went through, all the way through, our clinic could do abortions to 24 weeks. And so the booklet goes all the way through 24 weeks. And this is the tissue picture from the 16-week LMP pregnancy. Many women, of course, chose not to see their fetuses. Some expressed interest and then decided after seeing this that they didn't want to. Some asked if they could look at the workbook, and they took the book from us and read every page. And I think it's interesting that they did that in spite of, or perhaps because of the fact that in the state of Ohio, we were required to give them a fetal development booklet that looked like this, right? And they took that home with them at least 24 hours before their procedure. They were supposed to look at it. And this means nothing. This, on the other hand, meant something to them, right? The women who did view tissue gave a variety of reasons for their choice. Most said that they were just curious, or that they had seen pro-life images of abortion and wanted to see what it really looked like. Other women said that seeing their fetus provided them with closure and reassurance. They could see that the pregnancy was no longer in here and now it was out there. As a control freak, I completely understand that. Some women wanted to say goodbye, and they asked us to pray with them or for permission to sprinkle their babies with holy water that they had brought with them. This, I think, is one place where that gap between pro-choice discourse and abortion experience is very visible. Contemporary U.S. pro-choice discourse has long been a reactive discourse, and it's not necessarily our fault, right? But it's a reactive discourse, a politics of negation defined against anti-abortion accusations. And this defensive stance, I've long argued, has played a role, inadvertently, of course, in sustaining the social stigmatization of abortion providers, and of the women who choose abortion. I believe that if we were able to let go of some of those pro-choice defensive stances and embrace these more sort of complex realities of the way people live abortion, we might actually be able to mitigate some of that stigmatization from the right, and by extension, reach the hearts of the general public with our messages. So today, when I give presentations about abortion in classrooms, at fundraisers where it's a little iffier, or for congregations, I use the word baby. I explain why I'm using it. I say no one ever walked into the clinic and said, I'm having an abortion today because I'm pro-choice. And nobody ever walked into the clinic and said to me, get this tissue out of my body. That's not the way they talked about it. Women came in and said, I'm having an abortion today because I can't have this baby. And then they told me why they couldn't. A woman who comes in for an abortion knows that she's carrying a baby, and she knows that the abortion will mean that the baby dies. She has the abortion anyway because life is complicated, and she's doing the very best that she can with her situation, whatever that is. Now, I admit this is not an effective soundbite. I have not yet figured out how to put it on a bumper sticker. So if anyone's really good at that, let me know. But I think it rings really true for people on an individual basis, even people who don't like abortion. I just gave a talk on my campus yesterday morning before I left, and one of the department secretaries I'm close to, has invited me to her church many times. She's not to speak about abortion, but to get saved. Heard me speak, and she came up to me afterwards and she gave me this big hug and she said, my church teaches against abortion. You know, I never thought about it like this before. All by itself, changing our discourse, embracing the complexities, talking about babies is not going to change abortion politics in the United States. I'm not crazy enough to think that. Still, I think of Wendy Davis's heroic filibuster in Texas in June, and what she did was she read the everyday, normal, complicated, and mundane stories of women living with abortion and men living with abortion. And did these stories stop the legislature? Obviously not. But they sure did reach thousands of people who came out to demonstrate against the law in the subsequent special session. And of course there are risks. Many people who are pro-choice do not really know what happens in clinics. And that's why this kind of conversation, I think, is really, really important. Many of us who are pro-choice fear that if we start telling these more complicated stories about abortion, anti-abortion rights activists will use the stories against us, will use them against our side. Yes, they might, yes, they will. Not even going to qualify that. But you know what? They're using these stories anyway. And right now we have no power at all toward reframing them because we're not addressing them. We're diverting and letting them stand there unchallenged. And finally, telling these more complicated stories may increase the stress on some patients and providers. And this is something I know Lisa knows a lot more about than I do. But do you remember the provider at the beginning of my talk who asked about the people who used anti-language? I reached out to her after that workshop, and we had several online conversations. And she shared with me that she was really nervous about thinking about babies because of what that means about the work that she's doing and how she would feel about her job. And I shared with her some of my writing and some of my thinking and some of the stories from patients that I had learned from. And she seemed really excited about it at first, and she asked me if she could share it with her supervisors. She was in residency. And then I didn't hear back from her after that. And I honestly don't know where she is on her journey. If abortion rights advocates embraced discussion and images of the fetus and shared honest stories of the full range, from joy to grief to anger to embarrassment, of women's emotional responses to abortion, perhaps we could start to close the gap between pro-choice discourse and abortion experience, and maybe the gap between people who think abortion should remain legal and people who are willing to claim pro-choice as an identity.